Hi everyone, my name's Leanne Longfellow and I'm going to be talking to you today about the educational placement of students with disabilities. And it's a very contentious issue, it's a very emotional issue because it's intertwined with the notion of human rights. But before we begin, I'll just fill you in on who I am. So my background is that I was a special educator and worked in a range of different settings. And I did that for over 30 years. And more recently, I moved to higher education and doing professional learning for teachers, assistants, also work with parents, supporting them in the advocacy for inclusion. But as well, I have a disability myself and my daughter has severe multiple disabilities. So I've been both a teacher and a parent negotiating with schools around inclusion and around my daughter's education. So, and that's where I gained the most information actually through that lived experience. But we'll move on to our learning intention and success criteria. So our learning intention tells us where are we going, and the success criteria lets us know when we have arrived. So our learning intention is that overall big picture, and it is to support your understanding and awareness of the impact of educational placement on social and academic outcomes for all students, but with a particular focus on students with disabilities. And the success criteria is that you, each participant, will be able to define by the end of this webinar mainstream education, integration, special education, and inclusive education, and the interrelationship between those settings. And we're also looking at the Australian Professional Standards for Teachers. We're doing standard 1.6. I always target them at the proficient level. So standard 1.6 is strategies to support the full participation of students with disability. And the descriptor of that is to just demonstrate broad knowledge and understanding of legislative requirements. And we'll be talking a bit about the Disability Discrimination Act and the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So we'll be looking at the legislative requirements and teaching strategies. So we're touching base with things like universal design for learning that support participation and learning of students with disabilities. So the real focus of this webinar is to unpack what these terms mean, what mainstream education means, what integration means, what special education means, and what inclusive education means, because people become greatly confused and they think that mainstream education is synonymous with inclusive education, and it's not at all. They're completely different things. Yet people use them interchangeably, and that leads to a whole lot of confusion around what inclusion actually is. So mainstream education is not synonymous with inclusive education. So when people make statements such as inclusive education doesn't work for students with disabilities, they're actually not referring to inclusive education. They're saying mainstream education, because mainstream is not set up for students with diverse needs or students with disabilities. It's targeted towards the average student. So when people say inclusive education doesn't work, they're actually meaning mainstream education doesn't work. So the sentence, inclusive education does not work for most students with disabilities, is incorrect. But if we change the language, if we insert the term mainstream education does not work for most students with disability, well, that is correct. That is the correct language, and I'll be filling you in on why. Within mainstream education, it is targeted towards the mythical average student. So Todd Rose wrote a book, The End of Average, and he described the traditional mainstream education. And this is what he wrote in his book on page 51. He said, treating each student as an average student and aiming to provide each one with the same standardized education, regardless of their background, abilities, or interests. So that's targeting towards the average student. So within mainstream education, all students are compared to the notion of the average student. And we see that in our assessments, we certainly see that within NAPLAN, and you might see that within your school, how it's targeted towards the average student. And we've got these homogenous standards that are meant to work for all students. It's like a one size fits all. And we know that one size does not fit all at all. And so that's why we need inclusive education. So within mainstream education, when students don't fit that one size fits all, there's the identification of difference so that we can silo those students off to special education, to segregated settings. So what we find is that schools and parents as well, very much, if their child or if a student doesn't fit that mythical average, students are often sent off to have an assessment to see if they can be diagnosed with some sort of disability or difference. And then they are labelled and categorised, which is part of special education. But the whole concept of inclusive education is around reducing identification rates, because an inclusive classroom caters for all students. You don't need a diagnosis to have an accessible education within an inclusive education. Whilst within a mainstream education, you do need that diagnosis. So within a mainstream education, we like to reduce the identification rates to provide accessible learning experiences. And a way of reducing the identification of difference is providing early support. And we do that through the nationally consistent collection of data. We provide those beautiful tier 1, or here in South Australia, we call it wave 1 levels of support embedded within the classroom, so that we are catering for diversity without having to up the level of intervention. We just embed all sorts of rich forms of intervention within what we do daily to benefit everyone. So we might embed things like visuals. A lot of teachers use visuals, but they might incorporate that a whole lot more, because what we know is that that is catering for difference, and it does it very well. Another thing that's really important to reduce the identification of difference is to reduce fiscal or monetary incentives for identification. Currently in our system, we have a system that is based on a financial incentive if a student is identified as being different. And we see that once a student has a diagnosis, has a label, they tend to receive support. And they can be slotted into different forms of support if they meet certain criteria. Now, the nationally consistent collection of data works towards more of an inclusive system, so that we don't need a diagnosis. And certainly the NDIS, the National Disability Insurance Scheme, was based on the idea of addressing the functional needs of students. But it doesn't always play out well in reality. And we know that for a lot of people, it's a lot easier to access the NDIS when they have a diagnosis. And certainly within schools, it's still easier to access support when a student has a diagnosis. But we're making progress, we're making headway in not needing a label. Now, I'm not saying that a label is necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes having a diagnosis can be wonderful if students feel, or people feel, that their they're not quite the norm, they don't fit in, and sometimes having a diagnosis can be very helpful and can give them a lot of insight. But a diagnosis can also be quite harmful. So there's pros and cons with that. And we need to be really careful about not using a diagnosis in a medical type of way, fitting the medical model of disability where students are labelled and categorised. We'd like to use it in avoid addressing students' needs based on their diagnosis. It's far better to look at their strengths and their areas of need, their functional need, rather than basing it on a diagnosis. So you don't address the diagnosis, you address the strengths and needs of the student. So I've talked about mainstream education. So mainstream education is where it's not modified. There are no adjustments or very few adjustments for students, for a range of students, and we have a range of diversity in our classrooms. We have students from refugee backgrounds, students from trauma backgrounds, students who might have English as a second language, and there's all those rich forms of diversity, which is a great thing in our classroom, but we don't always cater for that so well under a mainstream model. And so that's why we have the special education model, which refers to segregated education. So students educated in special class, special school, special unit. So they're segregated. They may visit their peers in a mainstream class, but they're not considered a member of the mainstream class. They're just a visitor. They're just there as a guest. And within special education, it relies on labelling, and I've talked a bit about labelling and how that can be harmful. It relies on IQ testing. So we know that students in segregated settings have intellectual disabilities. But sometimes when a student is diagnosed with an intellectual disability, we don't presume competence. We don't look for their strengths. We look at this IQ test and think, well, that's all they're capable of. And that's really unfortunate. And what we know with growth mindset is that students are capable of a whole lot more. There's a whole lot more that they can do. And within special education, we often have prescriptive pedagogies. So we might have a life skills program, and life skills programs can be quite helpful, but they can be very prescriptive and limiting at the same time. So all of these areas have pros and cons. So in special education, it's often quite prescriptive, the pedagogy, whilst in inclusive education, students are accessing the regular curriculum, but just through an alternate access point. And that's really important. So another area that I'd like to address is, does special education have a place in inclusive education? This is something that is really contentious, and some people get upset with this, but I'm basing the information that I'm sharing with you on 4 decades of research, 40 years of evidence-based research. So it's not just my opinion, this is peer-reviewed research. So does special education have a place in inclusive education? They're completely different things. They have completely different philosophies. But unfortunately, a lot of people talk about special education and inclusive education as if it's just the same thing, just a continuum of choice. But actually, certainly for our students with significant disabilities and significant intellectual disabilities, really do they have a choice? There's a lot of gatekeeping, and that's certainly backed up in the research. Gatekeeping about where they can attend school, because mainstream education isn't set up for them. So mainstream teachers think, well, why would I want a student with a disability when there's a separate section, a special class, special school, special unit set up for those students. So within inclusive education, it is based on the philosophy of human rights. So human rights and valuing people with disabilities. It's very much embedded with a disability studies framework. And disability studies is very much about putting the voice of people with disabilities, putting that front and centre of everything that happens. And that's really important. And that doesn't happen within special education. Within special education, it's the voice of experts that's heard. So people with special education degrees, and I'm not knocking that, I have a special education degree, but it's really important that we develop agency and self-determination and student voice, even if students are limited in their ability, in their expressive language. It's really important that we access ways of them having a voice. So inclusive education is not just for students with disabilities, it's a way of teaching to the diversity of all students. And a successful way of delivering inclusive education is through co-teaching. And co-teaching refers to two teachers, usually a general educator and a special educator, teaching in the same classroom. So the teachers share the responsibility of planning, instruction, and assessment, and they work together in collaboration. So it's not the withdrawal of students, it's not the mainstream teacher teaching students in the mainstream and the special educator in a corner teaching students with disabilities. It's about working together. So it's a way of ensuring that students with disabilities receive the support that they need, that they require to be successful. And also in the co-teaching model, what's really important to point out is that often what happens in our schools is that students with disabilities are often educated by assistants, and assistants do an amazing job. But unfortunately, the research is very, very clear that when assistants, who are the least qualified person in the room, take on the sole responsibility of educating students with disabilities without the guidance of a teacher, and that does happen, and when they're asked to leave the room and the assistant is in charge of that student's education and in charge of communicating with the parents, that student is isolated from the rest of the class and it's not inclusive at all. So co-teaching is about everyone collaborating together so students with disabilities can be part of the class. And the other thing I want to say, to reiterate, that mainstream or general education without appropriate supports doesn't work, and it's the lack of support rather than the failure of the concept that results in inclusion not being successful. So inclusion can work for all students if it's done well. So inclusive education, if you ask 100 teachers what inclusion is, you will probably receive 100 different answers. But there is one universal definition, and it can be found in the United Nations Convention on the Rights of People with Disabilities. So that was, Australia ratified that in 2008. So ratification, what that means is that it's more than just signing a document. When you sign a document, when a country signs a document, it means they're working towards that. Australia ratified this, so it means Australia can be held accountable for what goes on in Australia in regards to human rights for people with disabilities. And what is really important is that within Article 24, they outline about inclusive education. And within Article 24, there's general comment 4, which just makes it a little bit clearer about what inclusion is. But within the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, it talks about inclusive education being a fundamental human right and it's the right of the individual learner. So it's not the right for parents to decide where they are to go, whether that be a segregated setting. It's the right to learn in an age-appropriate classroom alongside their peers. And it's based on human rights. And it's about eliminating barriers to education. And we can eliminate those barriers through universal design for learning is a great way of eliminating those barriers. So universal design for learning, coupled with those beautiful tier 1 or wave 1 interventions which are embedded within the classroom. So the countries that have ratified, and there are many, many countries that have ratified the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, we all have that universal definition of what inclusion is. However, within Australia, we have the Disability Discrimination Act, and that's what we look to in terms of educating students with disabilities. And we have the disability standards, which sits under the DDA and makes it explicit about our obligations towards students with disabilities. Within the DDA, it does allow for segregation under Section 45, and it is called special measures. So it allows for segregated programs or structures, these special measures, and that is in conflict with the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And some people have called for the DDA to be updated and for that section to be removed. So it is interesting that those two are in conflict. But if you've ever done any study of policies, policies often are in tension with each other and they don't always align well. And that is certainly the case with the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities and the DDA. So there are, as I said, we've got the UN Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, and that is where we obtain our definition of what inclusion is. There is a short definition of inclusion that I like to use, and it is: inclusive education is when all students, regardless of their disability, are placed in age-appropriate general education classes in schools in their own neighbourhood. So they're not being bussed across school, they're in their own neighbourhood, to receive high-quality instruction, interventions and supports that enable them to be successful in the classroom. And it involves making adjustments. So it's about being proactive rather than reactive. So universal design for learning is about setting it up from the very beginning, before you even see students. You set up your school, set up your classroom under universal design so that students can access what you are doing. The whole notion of differentiation, which is also important, but that is more reactive. So we see our students and we work out what their needs are, and that's what differentiation is, and we differentiate to meet their needs. But if we do a whole lot of UDL, universal design, we don't need to do nearly as much differentiation. So it actually cuts down the amount of work that we need to do, which is really important because teachers are super, super busy people, and especially at the moment with all this online and remote teaching. So inclusive education involves systemic reform. So it involves big changes, systemic changes, modification in the content, teaching methods, approaches, structures, strategies. So it's about getting rid of that notion of average, discarding it, and learning experiences are based on student strengths, while also providing appropriate support in areas for growth. So inclusive education is evidence-based, as I've said before. It works well for all students, works well for teachers as well. So when we're using universal design and being inclusive and embedding inclusive strategies, and there's a whole lot of inclusive strategies. So co-teaching is one, universal design for learning is one, those beautiful T1 interventions, using a formal group work called cooperative learning is another one. So developing the social skills within the classroom, which is really important. That social element is oh so important. So inclusive education is not about providing a separate curriculum taught by a special educator in a separate place. So no one is excluded within an inclusive classroom. So does inclusion work? Absolutely. And I'll just quote from Dr. Robert Jackson in 2008. He wrote, "No review could be found comparing segregation and inclusion that came out in favour of segregation in over 40 years of research." So we have 4 decades of research that states that inclusive education is the way to go. And he also says students in segregated education do less well than those who were included. And the longer they were segregated, the larger the gap with their included peers. So that's really important. So as well, Dr. Thomas Hare in 2016 did a systematic review of the literature for inclusive education. And he stated all the benefits, the same benefits that Robert Jackson stated in 2008. So Sharma has published a lot on inclusive education. So he talks about how schools can be confident that they are inclusive when they can demonstrate that all students, including those with a disability, so as you recall, inclusion is greater than just catering for students with disabilities. So it's catering for all forms of diversity. So inclusion is about presence. So the school welcomes and enrolls students with disabilities and those who attend the school on a regular basis. Participation. Those students can access a full range of school activities. Achievement. They achieve in academic and social domains and other important areas. And acceptance. They're accepted by their peers, by their parents, and by the school community. And that's very much that philosophical change. So disability isn't considered as a negative or a deficit. It's just a form of difference. Just as some people have blonde hair, some people have brown hair, some people have disabilities and some don't. It's not a big deal. It's just a difference. So Sharma's definition is very clear that inclusion is much more than a placement of a student in a regular school. It means that schools spend time and effort ensuring that students with disabilities and their carers are respected members of the school community. But what do teachers need in order to envisage an inclusive school, an inclusive classroom? What do they need to be inclusive educators? So they need a whole lot of support. They need a whole lot of professional learning. Because what happens with standalone professional learning, if you go along and do a one-day PD and you go back to your classroom, the research says that nothing much changes. So PD needs to be integrated into the classroom, and you need an opportunity to be supported and to put your learning into immediate use. And you need that coaching as you go along. So the philosophy of inclusion involves the elimination of the dual system of mainstream education and special education systems, and it then becomes a merged system responsive to the needs of all students. So let's just check in on our learning intention to support your understanding and awareness of the impact of educational placement on social and academic outcomes for all students, with a focus on students with disabilities. So we talked about inclusion, how that works for all students, not just students with disabilities, but all forms of diversity. And it makes classrooms much more welcoming for everyone. And our success criteria. Can you define mainstream education? And we talked about that. That's where it's directed at the average student. So homogenous standards, students have to meet a certain standard. Can you define integration? So that's where students are put within a mainstream education without supports. Special education. So special education is where students are segregated and taught in a separate setting. It might be a special school, special class, special unit. And inclusive education. So inclusive education is that high level change. So it's where we use UDL, we use co-teaching, and we embed tier 1 or wave 1 strategies within the classroom. But it's founded on a philosophy of valuing students with disabilities, and that's really important. And what is the interrelationship between these settings? So special education and inclusive education are quite different. Special education is based on a medical model of disability. Inclusive education is based on a social model of disability, and I do webinars on these concepts. So mainstream education is connected with those two. Mainstream and inclusive education are often, the terms are used interchangeably, but they should not. So people often refer to inclusive education and they say it doesn't work, but they're actually referring to mainstream education. The research tells us that inclusive education works. So thank you very much for joining this session, and I hope to catch you later. Bye for now.